So with that, welcome. My name is Nicholas Torres, and I serve in the capacity of Executive Director of the network TUFH. We have two guests with us, Bob Woollard and Akiko Maeda, and I'm going to turn it over to them to just do a quick introduction of themselves. After those introductions, we will launch into a formal presentation of a roadmap to policymaking and system change. We will then launch into some reactions from the panelists and our participants in terms of what their thoughts may be around those particular topics. And then the applicability of it, the network TUFH has drafted 4 draft policy goals, of which case will be a process that we are leading towards our Solutions Challenge in September in Darwin for thought leaders to really find some consensus and conclusions around those. But it will be a 4-month process leading towards that, and today somewhat represents the start of that. So Bob, would you like to do the first introduction?
Yes, it's a delight to be here. I'm Bob Woollard. I'm a professor of family medicine at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and have been involved in the social accountability movement, or cause, if you will, since the turn of the century, when I was involved in helping develop the white paper of the Government of Canada in expressing its desire to move forward with social accountability as a central pillar of Canada's medical schools. In any case, I also had the privilege of working with Charles Boland, and we co-hosted the Global Consensus on Social Accountability in South Africa in 2010. And in conjunction with Towards Unity for Health, I should say, we co-chair a task force for the network Towards Unity for Health on specific aspects of social accountability and accreditation. And in 2017, together with TUFH, co-hosted the World Summit on Social Accountability, which developed a work plan going forward, and are in the process of having developed a consensus document specifically on accreditation, which will be published in the FH later this year, and will form part of the discussion in Darwin. So that's a bit of a précis. I'm a family doc by profession, just retired from clinical medicine last week after 50 years as a physician. In order that I can get my 51st year as a husband, I needed to shift some priorities. So that's, I think, the useful part that I can say.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Akiko?
Yes, hello. Greetings from British Columbia, and lovely to meet all of you. I'm a health economist. I just left the World Bank, where I had worked for 20 years. Covering mostly Middle East, Central Asia, and European areas. But before the World Bank, I was also working with various UN agencies and lived in places like Yemen and Cambodia, some of the poorest conflict-afflicted areas, and dealt with not just health, but also education and social development projects in various contexts. I've trained as a health economist and worked as a health economist, but originally I was a biochemist, and my science background, I think, is something that has helped me a great deal in analytics, and that has also made me realize and question a lot of the work that we have been doing at the World Bank. I shouldn't say we anymore, I've left it. And so I just left last month to start working in a different direction. So it's a delight for me to be able to participate in this policy discussion and to share some of the deep concerns I've had with all the international organizations, UN as well as World Bank, in the way we do projects. Well-meaning as they may be, I think there's some deep flaws in the way we do things. And I hope that this kind of forum provided by TUHF and others will be a good platform for exploring these. And I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
A little bit of, I'm going to be sharing my screen, a little bit of background of where this knowledge is coming from. So I another hat I work is I teach at the University of Pennsylvania Fells Institute of Government, and that's where you teach policy. And so part of it is the idea behind this is can we move a lot of the network memberships institutions to also be policy and systems advocates, which will help move the needle on healthcare. And so a lot of this roadmap is taken from a variety of sources into this particular presentation. So welcome to the roadmap to creating policy and systems change. Before tackling a needed policy or systems change issue, we encourage an individual and or institution to conduct an analysis on the plausibility of achieving success. If after the analysis is complete and the plausibility of success is low, then the individual and or institutions needs to consider additional strategies before tackling the issue. So to start this analysis, we offer the following matrix. Looking at the columns, the person should note whether the issue is topical and urgent or non-topical and non-urgent. Looking at the rows, the person should note whether the issue is a society priority and a key decision maker cares about it, or the issue is not a society priority and a key decision maker does not care about it. So in the upper left-hand box, if the issue lands in the upper left-hand quadrant, then your action should be to provide the decision maker with the information and tools to advance the issue. That's ultimately where you want to land. Now, if the issue lands in the bottom left-hand quadrant, then your action should be to meet with key decision makers and make the case on why the issue should be a priority and how it's related to their particular work. If the issue lands in the upper right-hand quadrant, then your action should be about bringing it to the society's attention and focusing on making it an urgent issue. Now, ultimately, if the issue lands in the bottom right-hand quadrant, then your action might be to reconsider the issue at a time when it is either or both an urgent society issue and a key decision maker cares about it. Again, your ultimate goal is to move it to the upper left-hand quadrant, which increases your likelihood of being successful. So once you decide to move ahead with addressing a policy or system issue, we encourage 3 stages. The first stage is conducting an in-depth analysis. The second stage is formulating your argument for a policy or systems change. And the final stage is implementing your strategy. The first stage is conducting an in-depth analysis that includes some research on the issue that feeds into a clear articulation of the reason for the system or policy change. This is usually articulated in a policy brief that can be easily understood by key decision makers. The 2 essential components or arguments that we recommend to be included are the projected social and economic impacts. The analysis of any social and economic impact should be driven by data and research. And if data and research is not available, then clearly articulated logic. Ultimately, in this first stage, you are driving to a very concrete ask or recommendation that takes into account the history of the issue and its projected social and economic impacts. So as we move into stage 2, formation, we encourage you to formulate the social and economic or financial impacts of a recommended system or policy change. So we recommend framing the social impact within a social return on investment calculation. Those social return on investment calculations can be much more complex than presented here. We broke it down into 8 concrete steps that helps you frame your argument. Keep in mind that your ultimate goal is a short and clear policy brief that can be easily understood by the key decision makers. So the 8 steps are, first step number 1 is, in concrete terms, what is the social outcome of your social initiative or recommended policy or system change? This question often is the hardest to answer, as many social outcomes are challenging to measure. Nevertheless, you need to select something concrete that can be measured. Moving to step 2, we ask the question, what is the financial value of your outcome? What we've understood is oftentimes there is a research study from an economist or some other entity that has demonstrated and correlated a financial value with that outcome. So we encourage you to search for that research study and then cite it if necessary. If a research study does not exist, then you need to create a logical financial value framework. In other words, you are translating the social impact into financial terms for the simple reason that financial data is a universal language that policymakers and investors understand. The third step is to determine your success rate at how many people are projected to achieve the desired social outcome based upon your policy or system recommendation. The basis behind this question is the understanding that we live in a complex world and will not achieve 100% success. Therefore, it asks you to narrow it down to the percentage based upon research or your own data that will achieve the social outcome. The fourth step is to determine how many people who would have achieved the outcome on their own. The basis behind this question is that there are many factors that affect a person's life, and therefore many of the individuals that can achieve success might have achieved success with or without your systems or policy change. One suggestion is to do some research and determine the current baseline of people achieving success and subtract this from the percentage you believe your system or policy change would achieve success with. Fifth is multiply your financial value of your outcome by the number of people who achieve that financial outcome. In step 5, we get to the actual calculation, which is basically the number of people you affected minus the people who are not successful, minus the number of people who would have achieved success under current conditions, multiplied by the financial value of their outcome. The sixth step is also determining the number of years you may take credit for the social impact based upon your policy or systems recommendation. It's recommended never to take more credit for 10 years because life is complex, even though some policies might affect people for a lifetime, but in a social return on investment calculation, the longest period as policy or system change should be calculated as 10 years. You subtract the amount you spent on delivering the financial outcome, and you can reach a conclusion. Understanding this is a very simplified version of it, but we still encourage people to go through this exercise because it will help you articulate your argument of why the system or policy change is necessary. Now, policy and system change makers can appreciate the social impact and its relation to financial impacts, but often to make an influence change, they often need numbers more related to the economic financial impacts on a current budget or expenditures. For this reason, we recommend a few additional steps. So the first would be to determine the current expenditures currently deployed in the current model to address the social issue. For example, the government is currently spending this much amount of money to tackle this particular issue. The second step would be to determine the projected investment required to finance a recommended alternative approach. So this is really to say, if you did it differently based upon your policy or system change, how much would it cost? You can then calculate the secondary direct cost savings as stated in this social return on investment calculation, or subtracting 1 from 2, you can get start getting at number 4, which is your net cost savings. The key in number 5 is to determine when those cost savings would be realized, because it will not be in year 1. So oftentimes you have to think through of when those might be realized, which leads to number 6 and saying how much might the government need to or investor need to invest that finances the gap before those cost savings were realized. And then 7 is really to think through what your ask is. To do broad system change, oftentimes governments or large entities will not do their broad system change, so you might consider a pilot or a staged investment before full implementation. And then you really write your conclusions. Again, these 2 steps we think are really good exercises because it really helps frame what the argument is that ends up in your policy brief. Now that you have the logic behind your recommended system or policy change articulated, you can move toward the process that will ultimately encourage key decision makers to adopt your recommended actions. It's key to remember that ultimately it is people who make or influence policy decisions. Reflecting back to your goal or ask, and after policy mapping the cast of characters, you should also be cognizant of the means for change, whether it be legislative, legal, administrative, negotiation, political, media, or oftentimes not doing anything at all. You may not know the answer to this question until you meet with the different individuals and institutions within your policy map. Nevertheless, it's important to have an initial plan, but be willing to adapt it based upon the feedback or suggestions from the multiple groups. So key to this strategy, again, is the people. So you need to map out who these people are, their motives, and their relationships. You should think of people into 2 buckets, with the first bucket being those who might oppose your system or policy recommendations, and those who support your system or policy recommendations. Looking at this diagram, we realize that it is somewhat a circular back and forth process, with you at the center negotiating between both groups with a goal that a compromise might be realized that is a win-win for both groups. Ultimately, if you cannot find a compromise but still need to move forward your system or policy change, then you may have to seek strategies that neutralizes the opponents so that the recommended changes can move forward. If you cannot either find a compromise or you cannot neutralize your opponents, then you will need to revisit the timing and your strategy. Taking a deeper dive into policy mapping and the cast of characters, you should also be thinking about the people connected to the key decision makers and who might influence them. By doing this, you might also better understand their motives. By understanding a person's motives, you are better able to influence them or understand where there are opportunities for compromise. Again, you may be at the center of a circular back and forth process negotiating between both groups with the goal of reaching a compromise that is a win-win for both groups. This will require an in-depth knowledge of each group and then determining the best strategies, including a combination of individual, small group, or large group convenings. Assuming you go down the road of the legislative means for change, be conscious of what is lobbying and the specific motives of elected officials, which is often being reelected and therefore needing the votes to achieve that particular goal. As we finalize the policy mapping, you can move into strategy, formalizing the means, and influencing key decision makers. Assuming you have a compromise, make sure you define the required response by the industry and ensure that their actions are monitorable, enforceable within the resource base or expected resource base. Provide information to the media for public accountability, and then flay the influence brokers, particularly the heads of the organizations. If you are recommending legislative changes, consider the following strategies. Sending mass postcards, it's handwritten or personalized letters. They're often appreciated, especially in today's technology-driven society. Getting community and issue opinion leaders to telephone the office of the legislator, getting an article published in a regional national newspaper, meeting or calls with congressional aides or public officials' key advisors, and meeting them in their offices, meeting the legislator in their home district or country capital, and working with a lobby or coalition to apply a variety of approaches. No matter your strategy, you should remember to always be accurate, be brief, be clear with a specific goal, know your opposition, know the main arguments for and against a position or a piece of legislation, show them how they win, appeal to their enlightened self-interest, see it their way, and consider the messenger, and make sure you do a follow-up like a thank you note. One thing we also like to remind people is to not go it alone. Take the time to build a coalition showing that there are multiple groups supporting your policy or system change recommendations. It also protects all groups when it is a group rather than an individual or institution leading this particular change. So we ask you to ask yourselves the questions: who are similar organizations that struggle with the same issue? Who would endorse your issue? And you might even consider shifting a coalition to a trade association, which is more a legal entity that can represent the collective. In addition, we remember that it is often an NGO or nonprofit are oftentimes the best vehicles to influence change, as NGOs are obliged to be responsive to the public good. So finally, as you put this all together, it usually ends up in a policy brief. And so we recommend using this process in terms of writing the testimony and then using it also for testifying. But really start with your conclusion. Write your conclusion up front. What is the issue and what outcomes are you advocating for? Lay out the issue clearly and concisely. Talk about the rules, how it currently operates, the current rules and regulations. Talk about its application, how they can be interpreted and how it could be interpreted differently, why your issue is important and who would be in favor of what you are advocating for. And then end again with your conclusions, but short and concise. So again, this is a roadmap. It is more of probably an art and a science as you would negotiate between those two. But we go back to that first quadrant saying, ultimately, we want to increase people's chances of taking an issue and making it successful. So thank you very much. And why don't we turn it over, let me stop sharing and turn it over to Bob. Would you like to start us off? And then I'll turn it over to Akiko.
And maybe I should stay there. But anyway, I think you've outlined a useful broad framework and coarse-grained framework. And I think have drilled a little bit particularly into two contexts which are useful. One is the kind of American political process, which many people around the world have at least some familiarity with. And then the second piece is partly, I suppose, because of that culture, foregrounded the monetary measures and the animation political animation that sometimes is dependent on that. So, I think it's a useful framework to look at, partly because in other parts of the world, for example, Nepal, where I work, Uganda, where I work, the political system and the way in which one has influence can be quite different than that. But Stuart Menon, who is gratefully on the line, is a deep thinker in terms of complexity and moving from this is kind of a complicated view, which gives a nice framework. But you have alluded a couple of times to feedback loops, which is where I think we transform from simply measuring to how does the feedback loop, how does it work? And I guess I would just make two general comments that I hope would be useful. And one is that numbers never change minds and rarely change policies. That in fact it's narrative that changes policies and changes minds. And the main function, in my view, of measuring things and entering measurement into the feedback loops is to verify the narrative. I mean, we're living in a world where narratives are just picked out of the air, aren't grounded in any particular validation, and therefore, absent any grounding in reality, can be as outrageous as you want to make them. And I think we're seeing that now. So I think one of the things in this whole process to be aware of is somehow as we research, somehow as we develop the numbers and measurements, they need to be fed into a narrative approach. The second thing, that I think is worth thinking about is how you approach the issue. Not how you solve the issue, but how do you approach the issue? Because no matter how dysfunctional a political or a social system may seem to be, something in that system, complex as it may be, is actually working. Somewhere that function is actually animated and happening. And it can often be more useful rather than looking at barriers to change, rather than looking at opponents to change, which often very quickly devolve into excuses for lack of success. If one can seek out places where a complex system is having the hoped for outcome and analyze, well, why there? Why did this particular initiative in inner city Detroit seem to have a very positive impact on the rate of kids graduating from that particular high school? And building on that, you're liable to be more successful, if you will, in developing the narrative, having the influence on policy changes. And that's where I think your framework is very valuable, is saying, where is this? Does this involve legislative change? Does it involve regulatory change? I really like that slide because I think that's key in terms of where do you precisely put the influence. So for example, and then I just want to close with reflecting that in the 1960s, I was working in South Carolina. During the civil rights era, I lived kind of through the kind of culmination period, and actually was impressed with how society changed. And I think it changed because it was a legislative issue. And I was discouraged by how little things changed in the northern U.S. And the fact that the legislative fulcrum there, and for that matter in South Africa, I think is is an important observation, and I think it arises to some extent from your analysis of that. Sometimes the legislation is key. Sometimes the legislation doesn't matter because everybody ignores it. So that's a bit of a ramble, but I hope it's helpful to the conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Bob. And I'll turn it over to Akiko, and then we also have Stuart and Rob. So if you guys have anything to add, we'll give you that opportunity. So Akiko.
Great. No, thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. And thank you for this presentation. I think it lays out very nicely the complexity of developing a policy recommendation. And I'm, having been, in a way, a practitioner and dealt with policy advice to governments, mostly in developing countries, but also more recently, I worked in OECD for developed countries. And all the rationale is there. And we go through that. But one thing that I wanted to emphasize is that evidence is not enough. Just as Bob said, providing numbers and evidence is absolutely essential. I believe we have to be science and evidence-based. But having worked so many years on that, it's not enough, because human beings are not necessarily or frequently not rational beings. And so I've been very critical about the way the economics works, which has been based on rational expectations. You model and expect optimization and so forth. And this is where a lot of the project and operational sciences have come from. But I'm very happy to see that in recent economics, with the advent of behavior economics, we're introducing more of the science of individual and social behavior. And that has to inform the way we approach this. And so very specifically, as you mentioned, you have to find the interest groups, the politics behind it, which starts to get at the behavioral aspects. But in most of the projects I've worked on, it has not gone deep enough. It's not just power mapping and identifying oppositions and groups. We really have to understand the complex social behaviors. Some of the recent policies using nudging behavior and so forth is just a start. But we really have to understand not just the individual, but also in the group dynamics at the smaller group and at the national levels. And so I would really advocate for bringing in much more of the behavioral scientists, as well as there's some very important insights from evolutionary biologies from other primates, different social strategies. I think they will inform that because the way we set up, whether the regulatory system or legislative systems, they are too simplistic in dealing with the complexities. The second point I wanted to make was that it's about the way, because of the complexity of issues, we've all tended to narrow down the focus in order to achieve results for efficiency. Just as you said, you want to find where there may be low-hanging fruits and others. And I completely agree and understand that. But because so much of the recent project policies have been oriented towards that, we've ended up atomizing everything, segmenting everything, so that we miss the bigger picture. Now, I'm not advocating for people to try to solve the global problems all at once. But I think we all have to step back and rethink the goals. The equivalent in the medical field will be moving from disease or organ-specific to a much more whole person perspective. That doesn't mean you give up on deeper understanding of urology or specific disease. But we are looking more at the whole being. Just fixing the kidney doesn't fix the wellness of an individual. So the challenge we have before us is how do we bring a more integrative measurement in a way that the patient-centered, the PROMs and PREMs, the patient-reported outcomes and experiential measures are being brought in. We need the equivalent also for more of these social programs. Now, OECD more recently has been working on a wellness index. You say it's hard to measure social outcomes, but there is an effort, a serious effort to really delve much more deeply into these more holistic, but still very rigorous scientific measurements on how do you define well-being. And I think more work needs to be done. And how do we link to that? Because without that, all the social accountability and measurements and metrics are missing the big picture. And that's my major concern, that so much of our work in trying to define and be results-oriented have ended up in segmenting the outcomes to the point where we've kind of lost the real purpose of what we're doing this. It's not for economic growth. It's not for GDP. It's not for income. Those are just proxies. We need to think much more deeply about the wellness index and how these different indices contribute to that, and not exacerbate further the divisions and the silos that are actually being produced, generated by this approach. I'll stop here. Thanks.
No, I think that's fantastic. And I think you have reinforced a lot of what Bob was saying too. It's like the policy, the roadmap is really a process to think through it. But ultimately, as you both have stated, it's not because we have the data or the evidence or made the social or economic arguments for it. It really is about people and how you influence them. And that gets into the behavior sciences of it. So, I know Stuart's been thinking about this also, in terms of how he thinks about the complexities of that. So maybe Stuart, you'd like to respond to that, because part of this training process is everybody wants to know, how do you get it done? And everybody is at a loss for how you do that. So we can provide a roadmap, but there's how do you think through behavioral science and influencing people, and that's the complexities of it. But we're still trying to provide a roadmap for people to actually think through it. So Stuart, do you have any comments on that?
Thank you for this opportunity. How's that?
Yeah, much better.
I think several people have mentioned, and I will point out that I think we're stuck on problems and we're actually seeing patterns. So the difference between a problem that has a fixed solution with expert knowledge that can be broken down and resolved piece by piece and then reassembled is one paradigm, and that's been the paradigm for the last 400 years, 450. And we're now living in an age of complexity, and people are using the word complexity all the time as an adjective for difficult situations, hard to handle. And the question comes up is, how do we move forward and have solutions to problems that are continuous rather than close and finish? And thinking in terms of finite problems, that is, problems that are complex, problems that exist at scale and cannot be scaled up. When people see problems as finite and expert-driven and solution-driven and reducible, they try to scale them up because those problems can be scaled up. When people see problems as complex, and we can talk about what that means, because I think the understanding of what a complex human problem looks like is not well shared, and needs to be the next step, I feel, in the process, that people have to understand human systems as part of what we do, and not just numbers and guides. So how does one take action in the face of uncertainty? It's uncertainty that characterizes complex adaptive systems. And that goes right in the face of the traditional paradigm of certainty, control, predictability, reliability, and all of that. And as soon as we start talking about social determinants of health, social accountability, politics, economic, you're off the scale with respect to predictability. It's not there. And so you have to move into a logic of cause and effect that's nonlinear, that's complex. The causality of complex systems is through a different process than it is in linear, finite, expert-driven systems. And the classical era that's being continued pretty much everywhere, especially by funding agencies, I would say, is that they are applying expert-driven questions and outcome expectations to complex adaptive systems, and it doesn't work. And the reason they are doing that is they don't have an alternative that they understand and know that works. And there are alternatives that work. And human systems dynamics is very applicable to all the problems that you mentioned. But it has a different logic. And the logic is pattern logic, not linear logic. Patterns are dynamical. They move. They keep moving. Just like this talk has unfolded over the last several minutes. You can't get this talk from freezing one frame and listening to one bit. You need to have it over time in context. So this pattern of this presentation is unfolding. And in order to understand it, you have to see it as emerging. And it emerges through a process called self-organization. The causality in complex systems is through self-organization. It's not through proportional linear dynamics. And that paradigm shift is blocking progress. It blocks Nick from being able to apply what he described as a very elegant policy development application process. It blocks Bob from being able to deal with all the health professionals that are concerned with well-being and social accountability. And it blocks Akiko's previous employers from understanding how policy and distribution can be at scale rather than scaled up. So my feeling is that there's a basic black hole that can be filled and understood that will lead us to much more productive action. And that is understanding pattern logic, causality of patterns, and how one can do that. Understanding how we take action, informed action in the face of uncertainty. How complex systems actually work and don't work. How to be in inquiry, how to question in open, uncertain systems, and what kinds of simple rules are people following. Behavior, you talk about behavior. Behavior of groups of people creates patterns. When people accumulate on the sidewalk getting ready to cross the street, there's a big bulge of people. And then the light turns green and both sides come towards each other. And then they break up in straight lines, spontaneously self-organized so they can get through. And then they go back to. So people spontaneously self-organize following simple rules. When we have those principles in hand, it's very easy to make decisions and go in particular directions with policy and distribution of resources and evaluation and follow-up.
So Stuart, let me say, get Rob. Rob, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
Well, first off, my thanks. This is my first TUFH web conference, and I'm finding it very informative. I'm Rob Barnett, by the way, with the Northern Ontario School of Medicine in Canada as well. I find this very interesting, and what I find really resonates is the notion of difficulty in driving forward change that's segmented. I think the term was Akiko used, but more temporally segmented. My own issues in driving change locally, politically, all fall into conflict with the existing government cycle of change, if you will. So driving forward change in social determinants of health, long-standing patterns of effect, I have a lot of trouble finding traction when we're dealing with 4-year cycles of political turnover. So I wouldn't mind if folks are interested in hearing insight with regards to your experience in dealing with that dynamic.
And I think so. Thanks, Rob, for that. And I think it's a great question that will kind of lead into the second round, because I think we, as the network TUFH, are struggling with the same issue. So for years, we have this amazing conference that brings people together and that shares all these knowledge. We've been doing the symposiums that continues this conversation online for that. But ultimately, we have been contemplating really turning this into policy briefs that have both the economic and the social argument that provides a tool for people to use this as a tool to make changes and hopefully, as you said, gain traction on a local level or so. But as you've all said, and I think that has been reflected at WHO and the United Nations, but we still don't know how to gain traction. It's nice to have these policy papers out there, but we still need to give traction. So just briefly, before I turn it back over to Bob and then Akiko, these are the starting points of taking our own advice. We're kind of saying is like, if we were to put into concrete terms such global recommendations that could be translated to regionally, is one is sort of under our topic or pillar of population health. We've really focused in on these community health workers and saying, how do we get them to be part of a health team, but also recognized through formal training and accreditation, but also to the point where it could be formalized in terms of reimbursement. On social accountability, we're saying that, despite the fact that there's a lot of momentum on this, it's still a opt-in process of whether you want to be a higher education training institution that adopts sort of the criteria that goes into that. So what would be a policy recommendation that you could actually move forward, whether it becomes legislative, administrative, or recommendation, but really that's kind of mandates these entities to move forward with this criteria that is somewhat globally agreed upon, but not necessarily implemented. So that's sort of one thing we're struggling with there. The community approaches issue is that as we move towards policies that are mainstream health policy, the groups, there are certain groups that oftentimes get marginalized, whether they be remote and rural, whether they be indigenous, migrants, women, or elderly, because they're not part of the mainstream policy. So how do you make sure that they're not forgotten? So that, those are sort of the particular goal that we're thinking of that. And then there's this whole interprofessional education goal that, that we've said is like everybody agrees that there should be interprofessional education, but oftentimes you go to conferences and you do not have interprofessional. The doctors go to the doctor conferences, the nurses go to the nurses, the population health people go to the population health, and there's not always this interprofessional sharing. So, as I turn it back over to the group, is like, how do you, to Rob's comment, how do you actually gain traction, and how would you gain traction if, on behalf of the network? So you can take that any way you want, Bob.
Okay, well, I think, what I appreciated both statements, and I particularly appreciate Rob being here. I, for my sins, have been involved with the Northern Ontario School since before it was a gleam in its father's eye, as working consultant when that territory of Northern Ontario was basically a postgraduate playground for existing schools. And I think if we attend to the interplay of the framework that you've given us and the challenges that the other three have appropriately put on that, what I would say is this: the political legislative process basically came in terms of birthing the Northern Ontario School of Medicine from the political venue, where the narrative was, those guys down south are never going to look after us. We need to build our own school, and we need to build it on our principles. So that was the driving narrative, and a coincidental minister that had some influence and so on. And so that birthed the idea. But the idea, and I chaired the accreditation system when it came into being. So again, I have some fairly detailed knowledge. I think when it came into being, there was an explicit focus on relationships, in particularly the relationships and health needs of Northern Ontarians generally, rural, remote, and so on, which brings together some of our topics for today, Aboriginal folks in Northern Ontario, which are higher representation there than in much of Canada, and Franco-Canadians, where in an English-speaking, putatively English-speaking province, there was marginalization on the basis of language. So it was almost like this petri dish begging to be used in its development. And to the credit of the people, and there were many, many of them, we certainly give Roger Strasser a lot of credit for leading it, but there was a tremendous amount of community engagement. So the kind of community connection that Akiko mentioned as being important, the kind of relationships that needed to come together to create it, has resulted in interdisciplinary teaching, has resulted in distributed education, has resulted in a lot of things. What we need to do, and Stuart taught me this in the first time I ever heard him lecture, and the difference between complicated and complexity. Complicated is like shooting a rocket to Mars. It has actual rules. It has actual physics that's involved. You screw something up, you can figure out why you screwed it up. You don't do that again and you'll land on Mars. On the other hand, complexity is like raising a child. And so you raise a child and they're a wonderful child, then you have a second child. And people can often understand, even if they've just observed second children, of which I'm one, I must say, confess, you realize that there is no linearity there. There are patterns, and those patterns sometimes help, sometimes hinder. The thing you tried with the first child sometimes backfires with the second child, et cetera, et cetera. So not to bound too much on the example of NOSM, I would just close by saying that even I was called in to give an address to the University of Toronto, which most people in Canada would recognize as the center of the universe. The universe doesn't necessarily share that recognition, but one of the points I made when they said, where can we look for positive examples that will help inform us be more socially accountable and address social determinants of health and so on? And I said, well, you can look north, fair enough, but it's that, Stuart's first child syndrome. I said, but don't forget, NOSM was purpose-built. It's like building a new house to the design you wanted. I said, your challenge here is that you've got an existing house that you need to renovate. And it's always harder to renovate. I perhaps unfortunately said, particularly difficult to renovate an institution as self-important as the U of T, because it's a different nature of challenge. But there's some patterns that were successful in Northern Ontario that could be in this different context. And it's always about the relationships. So I don't know if that's helpful to the discussion, but we know that this is being recorded and other people may look at it, and it's helpful, I think, for us to be really clear about, what can we do differently that's going to get it. And I come back to that, how do you approach the problem, not how do you solve the problem? And I think if you approach it looking for things that work and understanding why they work, you're going to get a lot further than barriers to change and all of those excuses.
Thanks so much, Bob. Turn it over to Akiko.
Yeah, thank you. On the complex systems, I must say that my original training as a biochemist and microbiology has helped, because the models, when you're working on those levels, are very much a complex systems analysis with a lot of feedback loops. And a body doesn't work like a simple machine. It has so much integrated network approach. And so if we can learn from the way those groups work, I think that there's a good lesson to be learned from that. And I wanted to relate to that the new initiatives that are being taken in Japan. We're one of the oldest and aging society. The policy we have now, which is challenging, but I think it's the correct one, is to move towards much more of an integrated care concept, 2035, that's our vision, where integrated care is not about integrating different parts of medical care. It's moving way beyond that. So the integrated care has components, of course, of social services, medical, long-term care, but also about housing and about all the infrastructure that has to go with it. And that, I think, is critical because, as I mentioned, the investments in modern urban societies have built in those atomization factors, those suburbs with homes where the work is totally separate from your daily life. The work-life balance becomes problematic. And you end up, like in the United States, also in Japan, whole societies that are mentally depressed. US goes to opioids, and Japan goes to suicides. I'm sorry, but this is the reality. And so solving that problem will require much more of this systems approach. The step towards integrated care is one, but I would also like to add, and some of the initiatives in Japan are great because they're working on like co-housing so that the elderly live with the younger generation, multi-generation, recreating that community. So it's by design. And through those units, as was mentioned, it becomes self-driving. You cannot from top down put in a medical service and then put in a long-term care service and somehow shove it together. There has to be much more of a creating, more like the fractals. And this is how the organic systems work. So you're creating those nucleus of creative and fulfilling lifestyle. But in addition to that, we talked about metrics and measurements, and we need to move towards those integrative measures that then value those more integrative approaches. So the way that the OECD is looking at social and wellness index, such as social connectivity, actually measuring more rigorously whether that community is actually moving towards better social and cooperative approach, I think would be helpful. As long as we stay with the current economic poverty reduction based on income level, then we will never move forward on that. I'm thinking about in Africa, the investments that the World Bank has done, well-meaning for poverty reduction, has probably undermined a lot of those very valuable social connectivity. And one thing that we, as the World Bank, certainly did not look at is the importance of emotional well-being, of dignity. We should have looked at issues like music, theater, drama, how these are expressions and are critical to the well-being. Have we invested in that? Well, yes, there's some arts investment on the side. Like in the United States, arts is being set aside. These are critical glue of a society, and they need to be part of the whole emotional well-being package that has to be both measured, but also we have to think of creating those social networks that, like in an organic system, will self-motivate and develop, and then create laws and regulations that are promoted. But those laws and regulations won't create those original community networks that create these values and need to be developed further. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Akiko. Great points. Stuart?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that small communities, small families, small units interact very effectively because they operate with shared simple rules. As things get bigger, as we see bigger, more complex things happen, we're having trouble dealing with it. And as Bob said, how we look at a problem really defines how we go about dealing with it. And we tend to look at problems through the lens of cause and effect. I did this, that happens. And the way that sounds in projects like we're talking about is, what are the key factors? What's the root cause? Excuse me. What is the most important issue here? As if size and frequency and all of that is directly proportional to outcome. What we're saying about complex systems is that there is no proportionality. Small things make big changes, and big things can have no effect. And so what we're looking for is how to go forward. Now, when you talk about identifying successes, I think it's great. We need criteria that we all agree on success. However, after that, the question seems wrong to me. Once we identify success, the natural question that I see all the time, and especially in funding agencies, is how can we replicate that? How can we scale it up? And the answer is you can't, and you should stop trying. The question becomes, how do you achieve similar kinds of outcomes in the different contexts? Now, what's operating in a similar way, independent of context? Instead of focusing on context, let's look why and how complex systems self-organize. There's three conditions that drive the patterns that you see, whether it's at Northern Ontario, University of New Mexico, Calgary, it doesn't matter, or whether it's in Africa or Japan. Complex systems self-organize, and the rate of self-organization, the rate of change, the shape of the change, and the size of the change are regulated by conditions that we're not talking about. And that's where the conversation needs to change. This is a paradigm shift from control to uncertainty. How to work in uncertainty. There's three conditions. It's a theory developed by Glenda Oyoung. And It's responsible for the shape of patterns. What holds things together so they can interact? So, for example, this conversation, we're being held together by a common desire to talk about this subject on a specific date using this technology and having these. This is what's holding us together right now. And it's mostly value driven. It's mostly that we care about this and we want to learn from each other and exchange. It's pretty much value driven, but we're using technology to connect. Laws hold people together. Resources hold people together. Religions, cultures, physical buildings hold people together. So the container has to be open. This is an open system. It's not closed. It's open systems thermodynamics, not closed systems thermodynamics. Closed systems, everything is predictable, controllable, calculable. In open systems, it's uncertain because things can move in and out. Things happen, as we say. Okay. So the first condition is looking at what holds things together in an open system. Okay. So a medical school is held together by shared values of being on the faculty, doing research, doing patient care, being a student, being a part of the community of health, being part of the reach. All of that stuff is multiple levels, but it's what holds people together while they interact. Inside the container, that's condition one, what holds things together. And that can be changed. It can be expanded. If you change the size of the room, the space between people increases. If you contract the size of the room, the space between people becomes so tight that it becomes interpersonally uncomfortable. So we can change the constraints on the space. That's one variable. And it doesn't matter what context you're in. The second variable is difference. And this is the key. Everybody is different. Everything is unique. And differences and similarities hold us together in the container. Differences provide potential energy for movement. Difference provides potential energy for movement. So there's difference everywhere. That energy is what Prigogine and Stengers got the Nobel Prize for. The energy of tension from difference that's released, that's dissipated, becomes structurally reconfigured. So there's dissipative structure. When energy is released in a complex system, a new structure is formed.
So Stuart, I'm going to, we're out of our time.
Okay.
I want to finish off with everybody moving this from this behavioral science to the complex systems to something concrete. Because I think, what most of the audience and the members of the TUFH is, they want some very concrete of where to start. And so Rob, maybe you want to just say, taking from this conversation, it's like, where do you start? In entrepreneurship, we say, well, where do you start? We don't quite know, but you have to start. You can't sit and not do anything. You need to start something to start moving this change forward. And I think a lot of the audience really wants to know is like, this is fantastic. You've given us a roadmap. You've talked a little bit about behavioral science and, verifying the narrative and such. But now I want to make this real on my local community, and I want to influence it, and I want to start this process. So maybe a quick round, less than a minute or so for each one of you, is saying, what are your recommendations of anybody who wants to start influencing systems or policy? What is that first step? So Rob, I don't know, you asked a great question. So what did you take from that?
It breaks my heart because I want to hear the other aspects of this, but I have to chair another meeting that's kind of already started. So thanks, everybody. This has been absolutely fantastic, and I'm really sorry to leave so precipitously.
Well, thank you, Bob.
So what did I take from this? Quite a lot. I have a lot of thinking to do. But from my own context, I think that marrying the sort of complexity theory discussion that I've heard here today with the existing opportunities within the social political systems that I'm seeing in Ontario currently is where I'm going to start. We're in a bit of, not turmoil, but systems change, at least in terms of policy, and I think that probably provides us the opportunity to drive forward broader change around a social accountability method. So simply that's what I'm going to be looking at on a go forward.
Great, thanks. Akiko?
Yeah, no, thanks. I'd like to differ a little bit from one of our speakers about the uncertainty, because I think behavioral sciences has shown us human behaviors can be quite predictable as they are in a group. There are certain built-in ways. So learning from that, I think we have to do a lot more to bring those sciences in designing policies. For example, with the First Nations, indigenous cultures, how do we bring in the importance of emotional well-being, and as well as arts and sciences and culture? These are critical. We need to understand them deeply, not think them as a marginal add-ons. They express and they're an integral part of well-being. So then how do we connect with that in order to find the solutions to get out of a state of social dystopia in many cases, and to build the connections? So I hope that you'll have a chance in Northern Ontario to explore much more deeply that, and that's happening in Japan with our festivals and how they're so critical because you do things together jointly, and it gives the communities a chance to solve problems jointly. And if these models can be developed and entrenched in a society, then you can go to scale. I dare to say that, because human beings have some similarities, and they can go viral in a positive way, in a positive culture, or it can go negative in the way that ISIS and terrorist groups are doing. So there's a lot to be learned from those lessons. Thanks.
Okay, great. So Stuart, any last words of where somebody starts?
You start by figuring out where you're stuck. Okay, where am I stuck? What is the thing that I can't get past? What is the thing that keeps coming back over and over again? What is the thing that I try to fix but doesn't get fixed? What is the thing that I can't figure out? You start there and you ask, what is that? And you clarify it. What's the data? What do I know? What can I find out about it? And then you ask two more questions. One is, so what does that mean? So what does it mean for me, for my colleagues, for my school, for my region, whatever? And then finally, given that, which creates meaning, now what can I do? Right now, what small step can I take to move in the direction I want to go, to shift what I'm seeing? That's where you start.
Great. So this is, I think, this is just the beginning of the conversation. I think, what we're doing is hopefully using the network TUFH as a catalyst to bring some of these complexities, but really talking to the people, the thought leaders, the people who really have the ability to do this, bring them to the table at the solutions challenge that we have. And then together, collectively, they'll be able to do that. But understanding that not everybody can attend the conference, we're hoping that this becomes the framework for an ongoing conversation that capacitates and gives people at least a roadmap, a thought process to think through as they want to make change at their local level. So I thank all of you, Bob Woollard, who signed up early. Akiko, thank you so much. Stuart and Rob, thanks for pitching in terms of this. And again, this will be recorded. We will then publish it on the website and use it as a tool to set the future direction of this conversation. So I wish you all a great day, and to be continued. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So assuming everybody's familiar with the network TUFH, is, we provide this annual conference, and we convene thought leaders across the globe for this annual conference that are focused on the four particular topics of social accountability, population health, community approaches, and interprofessional education. But part of our end game strategy as a collective, we want to hopefully bring everybody together to say, what if, as we make policy changes and we want to capacitate people to make changes locally, is we need to provide some guidance and guidelines of what that particular ask may be. And then there's two processes. One, that we can feed it up to global organizations such as WHO and the United Nations. But more importantly, we realize that, part of these recommendations need to be implemented locally. But then with those particular tools. So the one that we're currently playing with for population health is the issues of population health is that healthcare outcomes are not necessarily determined only by the healthcare itself, but by the social environmental factors around it. And the particular goal that was discussed, at the United Nations was a workforce goal, and so they're projecting a huge health workforce gap in the upcoming years, both from medical doctors and could be nurses or midwives. But there's also this new concept that's being played out in very different ways across the globe for this community health worker, but it's not formally recognized as part of the health team. So, part of it was to say is like to standardize the role of the community health worker on a global, but it also can be regional scale that recognizes them as part of this health team. But there needs to be some standardization of their competencies, recommending formal training and accreditation, and policy recommendations toward formal recognition that includes incorporating them into the reimbursement process for any healthcare. So this is a sort of taking our own lessons. We're saying is like, how could this be a concrete ask in terms of both on a global scale, but then also regionally. So we wanted to just throw it to you, all of us, and say, what are your ideas? Would this make sense for your governments, for your particular roles of the community health worker, and what might be the challenges that you come across for this?
So I don't know how much you know about Ethiopia, but we have a very famous community health program. It's called Health Extension Workers. It was started back in 2003. We have more than around 40,000 health extension workers. The unique feature of this program in Ethiopia is they're government employees. They are not volunteers. They receive 1 year of training after completing 10 years of schooling. So it's a post-secondary training, sort of vocational training for 1 year. And then, they could, after a few years of service, they could get additional training to upgrade their level. So the basic level is called level 3, then level 4. But the biggest challenge, and before I go there, they are credited for, the massive improvement in immunization services, contraceptive, and sanitation. Now, the challenge we have been having to sustain this program is the initial idea of recruiting, someone from the community and expecting them to work there forever, became unsustainable a few years down the line because they wanted to get chance for transfer, like they want to relocate to a more urban place, when they get married or, for better education. So that quest for transfer, that quest for moving to other places has put under question the initial idea of, recruiting someone locally and expecting them to continue to provide services for a long period of time. So that's a challenge. I would stop there. Yeah.
That's great.
It's Kim here from Australia.
Yes.
So in our area, one of the biggest issues for us is around recruitment, retention of staff, particularly around allied health is the area that I'm interested in. And we've been looking at local recruitment and wanting to also really target First Nations Australians in that recruitment so that we're getting better coverage and culturally appropriate service delivery to improve the health outcomes. There's major inequities between First Nations Australians and rural Australians who live in rural and remote areas and urban dwelling Australians. And so some of the issues we have are exactly the point that was being made around people wanting to move through and developing a bit of a pipeline and a pathway so that we're not relying on one person, that we're actually looking at this as a career path for people. But, you know, that does then mean there's an ongoing need for investment in that training and moving people through. But in the long term, we're finding that people from rural areas are more likely to go to other rural areas if they become, you know, start out as an allied health assistant or an Aboriginal health worker, and then go on to train and become a health professional of another kind. They are more likely to come back to another rural area, and sometimes their rural area of origin. So it's a long game, and the biggest challenge is government funding doesn't have a long view. It's often very short term, a term of government. Sometimes it's only 12-month funding or at the most 4-year funding. And so this is the problem around policy driving and policy change, when it actually needs a longer view and there isn't the will there.
Yeah, just wanted to say that there is actually like a policy. We have a very high prevalence of non-communicable diseases with high prevalence of cerebrovascular accident, getting people to become bedridden. And the policy is to provide, to give like physiotherapy and getting the people rehabilitated and back on their feet again, only after as from the age of 90. Whereas this problem occurs much earlier on. And I think it would have been better if we were providing these facilities early on, as the person gets into the disease and give the person back his autonomy. We would have saved so much on even pension, like on paying carers and everything. But we are not able to get the people to understand that we need to provide these facilities, physiotherapy, occupational, and so on, much earlier on in the disease instead of waiting till, like the policy stands right now, often as from 90 onwards.
Hi. In South Africa, we've had a cohort of community health workers that have traditionally been focused on home-based care in the context of HIV and then acting as TB supporters. More recently, there's been a commitment, at least at the policy level, to bring in ward-based outreach teams with a much stronger focus on maternal and child health. But that's going to require significant reorientation and training of community health workers. There's been concerns around community health workers' conditions of service. Many are employed by, or historically been employed by NGOs, poorly remunerated, often waiting for long periods to be paid. So very, very vulnerable workers on the fringes of the healthcare system. Last year we've seen progress where there's been an agreement by government to include community health workers as part of the system and to pay them the minimum wage. So that's been a huge victory. But we've also discovered, well, there's also concerns that the distribution of the community health workers that we have is very uneven. They're not available in the regions or the districts where we need them most. And then again, that becomes a question of how do you move? You can't move people, uproot them from their communities by force. And then there's concerns around the scope of practice and the training. And in the context of calls for greater and greater task shifting. So we were asking community health workers ideally to take on a much bigger role in terms of curative medicine and even mental health. But we don't necessarily, we're shortchanging them within the healthcare system in terms of their training, in terms of their supervision and support.
So that's just those simple the examples that the four you provided. gives great context. And what we're trying to do at the network is really to say the role of community health workers across the globe is defined differently, but there are some common themes and patterns. And our contribution really can do is maybe frame this within that economic, financial, and social impact arguments within a policy type of paper that then you can use as a tool to make your changes locally. But we also want it to be reflective of a global economy, which is why this is a process, and your feedback and feeding into it, the framing of the argument is so important that we will ultimately realize at the conference, which is in Darwin, Australia. But I think to your points, all we can do is kind of frame what the issue is, and yet understanding that it is important to know the long game. It is a recruiting and pipeline and retention issue. But if governments did do it a little bit differently, then these are sort of the financial impacts they will have. And to have each one of you have those tools helps you at least one stage further. So that's at least our theory behind it. It's not completely articulated. This is going to be a 4 or 5 month process, but in September, October, then we should be able to provide you with a tool that frames that particular argument under population health. Now, there's tons of things under population health. We just said we need to be concrete. So this is the one that I think we're playing with right now. We have another session later on today on this topic. So unless that other group has something different, it seems to me this seems to be where most of the traction is, where it's urgent, people are paying attention to it, and groups like WHO and United Nations have deemed it a priority. Let me move to the second one, which is the social accountability. So, part of this issue, we have a group that, that in spite of the growing worldwide momentum in favor of the concept of social accountability and a lot of achievements, there still remains this large gap between good intentions and institutional transformations. So this may not be a legislative change, but it could be a legislative change, but more of an administrative change where we want our medical, population health, or health systems to adopt the principles of social accountability. But there is this idea to say maybe there is a requirement by government or accreditation or insurers that, that institutions should, adopt or comply with social accountability criteria. Somewhat simple, but again, we're trying to start it with simple and concrete. So was wondering if any of you had any thoughts on this one. And there will be a consensus paper driven by Charles Bolin and Bob Woollard. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. They've brought together probably, I think, 60 countries around the globe for this consensus paper that will be re-released, I think, in June or July. But again, it's a great paper, but the challenge is, can you get institutions to adopt it, this type of behavior, when there's no necessary pressure to act in the social accountability way, if they're not forced to by government through a policy or systems mandate?
There is growing interest, at least speaking from Ethiopia's experience. The Ministry of Education has been encouraging greater coordination and collaboration, cooperation between higher education institutions and the community and the industry. Particularly in health training, Ethiopia has more than 3 decades of experience in community-based education. I had my medical education in one of the largest universities in the country, which has a philosophy of community-based education. It says we are in the community, what we do, whether it's a teaching, the service, is always for the community. And that experience has spread to many higher education institutions in Ethiopia, where they include community element in the undergraduate and postgraduate training. But I agree with the statement, good intentions often are with some faculty, and not every faculty appreciates, the value of that kind of training or that kind of exposure to learners. During the community-based education, we do community diagnosis, we do programs to educate the community about health. We undertake other health promotion activities. But, it's not always funded to the desired level, and not every faculty or not every student body fully understand, why, we do community-based education. So, you would think the potential is not fully realized.
Yeah, great point.
In relation to allied health training in higher education here in Australia, there, again, for the rural and remote populations particularly, which is the area that I'm interested in, there's a lack of support for allied health student placements and experiences in relation to other kind of professions that are supported. So there is a disparate or a much greater gap in access to allied health services in rural and remote communities in Australia. And so there are intentions in terms of the universities taking in First Nations students and rural and remote students as into those courses, but there's not the extra support around people then going back in to do their student experiences in those communities. And there's also not enough effort around campuses being located in rural and remote or regional areas, so they're more accessible for people from those communities who may not want to move to a large city. So there's still some work to do around that. There are some good intentions and some targets being set, but the implementation, there's some unintended consequences, and the implementation has some gaps in it.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, I think you're, the challenge is oftentimes implementation. And, when you look at the social accountability, it also gets to one of the goals of interprofessional education, which is the same. Oftentimes it's, I think part of this idea is to move it from a one-way street where, allied health may go one way, but it's really to say it is a two-way street, and to get both groups to value both aspects of that. And, and we have this question, it's like, do people do it because of good intentions, or do they do it because they're mandated to do it, or there's criteria? And I think that's this one area we have. So again, it goes back, I think Kim is like, our contribution is going to make the economic argument of why people should do it this way. And then ideally, the local actors can use it as a tool to advance locally in terms of those different things. But you said one important piece that, unintended consequences, oftentimes we have good things, but it can have unintended consequences that we have to be considerate. And, globally, you can't take that in consideration. Those have to be also for locally. But yeah, it's this question like what motivates people. And yeah, your point is, very well taken. Lori or Farhadi, any additional thoughts?
We at the University of Cape Town have a strategic goal which is entitled social responsiveness, which I'd imagine is very similar to social accountability. And then we also have an engaged scholarship program, which is bringing together people from across the university who are engaged with community-based programs or with industry or with policy making to, in a sense, build a community of practice. And then those social responsiveness or engaged scholarship criteria have been woven into the ad hominem promotions process. So we've created a very direct incentive for individual researchers to engage and to think about how to harness the potential of their work for public good. What's tricky is that really good engagement doesn't happen at the individual level. It often requires collaboration that takes place over an extensive period of time. So the question is, how do you create a reward or incentive system within universities to support that longer term collaborative work and to reward it? So I could certainly link you to some of the resources and the materials that sort of fit within this broader engaged scholarship discourse, if that's helpful, because I'd imagine there'd be quite a lot of similarities between the two.
Yeah, and Laura, I think you bring up this point. Part of it is to say we can make a policy paper or so, but one of these what times is very valuable to local groups or local universities is best practices. So one thing that we're doing is we're moving towards a publication that's sort of a practitioner journal publication written by and for practitioners as a vehicle to share best practices, how they did it. Because you're in South Africa, but somebody in Australia might say, it's like, oh, that's a great idea. How did you do it? And we want you to provide that recipe for that. So after this, Laura, if you want to email me that, we're working on this publication, one for social accountability, one for population health, but really just for practitioners to share how they got some of this stuff done, because oftentimes that's where we can, people can learn from each other and say, oh, we love the way that somebody did it somewhere else. So I will put in the chat box my email, and if you want to just send me that, then I can maybe you want to be connected and even put some of these ideas into a short article.
That would be fantastic. I think the other thing that's sort of come up in our local conversation is to look beyond engaged research and service, and also to think about models for engaged teaching. So recognizing that universities are producing students, and what are the kind of qualities we want to see in our graduates, and how do we inculcate them through our course design. And that sort of touches on the kind of questions Kim was raising about where students are taught. But it's also a question of how they are taught, who they are taught by, what is rewarded. Yeah, so it's redefining, in a sense, the value system of the university and reorientating it in quite a fundamental way.
Yeah, and I think, again, Charles Bolin and Bob Woollard, who are championing this consensus paper, my understanding is I think your social responsiveness is very similar to the social accountability, and I think they framed the issue very well within that. And that, again, we will distribute that through the network once it becomes available. But, we're just going to add on the economic arguments and the social impact arguments. But to your point, I think there's a lot of groups who are on board to this, but that does not necessarily mean that we've incentivize universities or other actors to act in this particular way, and that's why we want to give you the tools to do some of that.
That sounds fantastic. Excellent.
So we have just a couple more minutes. So I just, here I just want to share with you I'll share with you the other two, and if anybody has any final comments on this. So, we specialize, or we're trying to specialize, not necessarily ourselves, but through our collective membership in groups that oftentimes are, in a sense, marginalized. And, those are remote and rural, indigenous, migrants or refugees, women and elderly populations, which oftentimes, and what a lot of our advisors and thought leaders are saying is that, as people move towards mainstream health policy, these groups are often, it's not that they're ignored, but they're not included in these mainstream practices, leaving them sort of aside and leaving them marginalized. So then our ask, as we're trying to frame this policy and systems argument, is that they are always mentioned. They're not forgotten in the mainstream health policy, and they're recognized in global, national, regional policies and practices. So again, making sure that this argument is always front and forefront, because we like to make things easier. Therefore, we take care of the 50% of the population that falls into those mainstream policies, but we forget about the other ones. So that's the one thing that we're working with. And then the other one, of course, goes a little bit into what we discussed before, social accountability, but really this interprofessional goal, which is, at the very core, we're just saying, if we can maintain a balance between medical, public health, allied health, and Kim, I think to your point, putting that in there specifically, and population health participants, is saying people tend to go to conferences that are within their own silo, but therefore they don't interact. So we're saying is like, maybe there needs to be some type of endorsement, maybe not a policy, but more of a system that encourages this. So those sort of are our last two ones. I know we don't have as much time to go into detail or dive into these, but if you any additional comments on these would be very well appreciated.
Could I dive right in and comment on the first one? For me, there are two constituencies that are conspicuous by their absence. The one is children and the other is adolescents, both of whom have a right to participate, and both groups tend to be marginalized, excluded, objectified, and in the case of adolescents, often vilified by the healthcare system. So really a call to develop much more child and adolescent friendly healthcare services. So I'd be worried to see them excluded from this community approach.
Great comment, thank you.
I would, if I can jump in, I think the other thing for me is the focus on well-being as being a start point rather than healthcare. The point before about, working with people kind of after the fact. That's a very strong thing for me in these communities that I work in rural and remote areas. That access to acute health services sometimes is the primary focus, and I understand that shouts very loudly, but if we're really looking at a broader thing about health and well-being, then that's a really key part of an emphasis there. And also, again, just another plug around the breadth of contributions from a range of allied health professions that can have extremely important impacts on people's mobility or their capacity to work and support their community and family, etc. So that broader allied health intervention at a community level through community workers or assistant type models is something that I'd really promote.
Great, thank you. Any last comments for Rita?
Yeah, I just wanted to add here on the community approach is that we need really to establish well-defined station where people in the community wanting to reach the established health system, there are facilitators there which help this coming from the community. A lot of them, mostly elderly, we find very, very vulnerable people there. When they're elderly, they are stuck in their bed and they are not able, they have no means of communication. How possibly can we draw a pathway for these people to get across their difficulties onto the health care system? I think that would be important.
Great. Well, thank you for joining this. As mentioned before, the next concrete steps. One is I will send you the PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully you find it somewhat valuable and as a roadmap. We have another group who doing it on the other time zone to participate in this process. And again, this will be sort of a ongoing process that will be at the Global Solutions Challenge, where a lot of thought leaders will come to some kind of consensus on what these papers and these policies may look like. But the ultimate goal is to have this a full loop that comes back to you and everybody else, so that you have some tools and hopefully some ideas of how to make some of this changes locally. And the more we do this, the bigger, I think, coalitions we will build and sort of that. But we will share this initial knowledge. Thank you for your feedback on framing these issues, because that helps us do the work right, and as a collective rather versus an individual organization. But again, it's great meeting everyone, and thank you for your time.